Yes. Because I don't want only me to hear what I say. Because I know everything I can say. Actually, yeah, I mean, it's a special pleasure to be here in Stavanger. And there are also many countries which I visited along the coastline. And I'm happy to say that I was in Narvik, Kirkenes, Molde, Tromsø, Bergen, Trondheim, Lillehammer, and some other places. And I was always thinking that actually Norwegians are the most curious people. Starting from my first experience in Drammen in '92, when my friend with her small children lived at that time, and the kids were watching kids program on TV, and the presenter was talking to kids, and kids were answering to TV set. It was before internet interaction. So I think maybe actually the internet was invented here. I'm happy to see many young people here because sometimes I feel, I mean, usually I feel myself young, but I'm 61. And my life actually consists of two parts, equal in length, but very different in content, because I spent 30 years in the Soviet Union and 30 years in independent Ukraine. And I was born in Leningrad. I grew up in Kyiv when everybody spoke Russian in Kyiv, and my parents are Russian, although we have connections with Don Cossacks and with relatives which lived on the border between Poland and Ukraine. So I assume or I suspect that actually my love for freedom and for anarchy comes from this part of the family, and it fits very well with Ukrainian mentality. So, I mean, the question of mentality probably I will touch upon later, but I remembered actually 1 hour ago when I was in the army, and I was a prison guard in Odessa in the army. Somebody in Odessa, and Odessa is a Jewish, Ukrainian, Russian, Moldovan, Greek city with lots of humor, which is abandoned by Jews, but people still speak Russian with Jewish accent. So, I mean, this is the capital of Ukrainian humor, actually. And somebody in 1985 told me one phrase which stuck in my mind, and I even quoted in one of the novels. When you love your motherland, it doesn't matter who is in power. And I was regularly, actually, every 2 or 3 years thinking about this. And I didn't have so many questions about it when I was in the Soviet Union. Because in the Soviet Union, you are not born in the country, you are born in the system. You were born in the socialist system with the same government, different faces, the same system. But when in 1991, Ukraine became independent, I got very excited. Because actually my identity in the Soviet Union was I was Soviet, anti-Soviet young man, which was very fashionable, not very dangerous. I was reading banned books which were brought to my brother by his friends. They were real dissidents, actually they were in prison sometimes, they were mistreated, but I was just a young man who was trying to read what was banned, and it was exciting. To be a poet at that time, it was actually also a very exciting thing because I was writing poetry, and the poets were meeting up, reading to each other poems, drinking beer, talking about freedom and the broadcasting programs of Voice of America. And there was some kind of feeling of slight danger, romantic danger, which didn't last very long. But in 1991, actually, the whole system of Soviet Union collapsed together with social system, together with political system. We got chaos, criminalized society, no police or corrupt police. The feeling of real danger from the crime life outside, and the first $100 that I earned, I invested in bulletproof doors on our apartment. And this period lasted for some years. As the result, actually, we have 3 apartments in Kyiv, 1 studio where I work, and 2 more apartments, and they all have bulletproof doors. And even our countryside house has bulletproof doors. So, I mean, Ukrainians adapt to dangers, but sometimes actually dangers don't adapt to Ukrainians. So they think they are greater, and they expect Ukrainians to be afraid, to fear, and to flee, but Ukrainians just prepare for the danger and stay in the same place, in the same position. Well, same place, to say same place probably is not very appropriate now when we have up to 15 million people displaced, 7 million refugees abroad, and actually all this circulation of people, involuntary circulation continues, because now the government is asking people to be evacuated not only from occupied territories but from the Ukraine-controlled territories of Donetsk region, Zaporizhia region, Kherson region. We are living now in the war time. And still, actually, I feel, looking back at my life, even now I feel more happy than when I was in the Soviet Union, because I'm grateful to Ukraine for feeling free all these 30 years, in spite of all the problems we had and we have and we will have. And what is important now, that actually I think that when you leave your country, it matters who is in power. It matters who is in the government, who is the president, because in Ukrainian tradition, to have no respect for politicians, for the government, for the president. Ukrainians actually are anarchists, not only in heart, almost genetically, because in 16th century they were choosing their leaders. They never had royal family. We had elections of hetmans. Hetman was the head of the army and the head of state. They had elections of the higher officers. They were electing judges. Judges were also corrupt like today. And there are cases, very famous cases, when I think, if I'm not mistaken, Hetman Mazepa actually asked the judge to prosecute Colonel Kochubey, because Colonel Kochubey didn't allow his daughter to marry Hetman Mazepa. This is also a very Ukrainian story. But the main thing is that actually for Ukrainians, freedom is more important than stability or quality of life. Unlike in Russia. In Russia, stability is more important than freedom. And of course, in Russia, if you love your motherland, it doesn't matter who is in power. You accept it, because this is a system of monarchy. If you have a king, the king is given by God. You have to adore him. If he misbehaves and you get upset, you kill him and you love and adore the next one. In fact, actually, only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I realized that Soviet Union was a communist empire. It was a monarchy, because we had elections, but the same person was elected, re-elected, re-elected until he died, except one Ukrainian, Nikita Khrushchev, who tried to break the system, but the system broke him. But he wrote very nice memoirs, for which I am very grateful, because I used his memoirs in my novel, The Bigford's Fuse, which is not available, unfortunately, in Norwegian, but available in English. I will start now what I prepared for you, but I will actually interrupt myself and we'll talk more, because I prefer to talk than to read. But being responsible writer and understanding the word lecture means different thing than the word talk, I decided to create some kind of hybrid. When a war starts, the days and nights become shorter. Everyone hopes that a new day will bring the end of the war closer, so the faster the day flies, the sooner peace will come. War does not allow you to live, nor does it allow you to sleep. War does not allow you to think about anything else but war. War does not allow you to read books or to go to the theater or to the cinema. War leaves people with one thought only: the constant thought of war. Everyone who lives in a country at war knows about this. War becomes the main theme of life, and the main goal of life becomes survival if you are a civilian, and winning if you are in the military. Words like freedom take on urgent new meaning. The prospect of losing it is terrifying. The realization that some people must die to defend it, an unbearable injustice. The notion that your country might be able to negotiate to mitigate that threat seems ridiculous, like negotiating the conditions of confinement in a top security prison, where the prison authorities are cruel taskmasters who have never read, let alone agreed, to follow the United Nations list of human rights. This war, which began in 2014, has long changed the lives and mindsets of Ukrainians. It has impacted on every aspect of life and could not but affect the state of Ukrainian culture and especially that of literature. Let us take a closer look at some Ukrainian writers, their homes, their home lives and their biographies. Let us consider how their lives have changed since the beginning of Russian aggression. Ukrainian literature has a very interesting story, especially in the post-Soviet time, and it is easier to explain what was happening in Ukrainian literature since 1991 than to explain what was happening before 1917, because you will not find Ukrainian classical books translated in foreign languages. This is a paradox. You will not actually read Ukrainian contemporary fiction understanding the context and the history of Ukrainian culture, because Russia was investing hard in promotion of their classical literature. So, I mean, you have an alternative. You can look for Ukrainian roots in family trees of Dostoevsky. There are Ukrainian roots, but there is nothing Ukrainian there because Dostoevsky was fatalist and Ukrainians are not fatalists. They suffered much more than also Dostoevsky, who was condemned to death and then pardoned by the Tsar, but they always were looking on the bright side of life if they were surviving in the situations like artificial famine, deportations, prisons for dissidents, etc. And in 1991, actually, what happened, apart from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Ukrainian literature collapsed. 5,000 members of Soviet Writers' Union suddenly found themselves without jobs, with a useless membership and without possibility to publish their loyal to the Communist Party works, because nobody read them, and actually nobody read them before. But the system, I mean, the myth about Soviet Union as the most reading country was based on the number of copies published. Any copies. I mean, 55 volumes of great Soviet encyclopedia, several million print run, 55 volumes of Lenin works and his correspondence. It was also included in this statistic. So actually, we didn't notice disappearance of Soviet literature in Ukraine. And from the whole army of 5,000 people, there were 3 or 4 writers remained who managed not to write about the Communist Party before. It was Pavlo Zagrebelny, Evgen Drozd, Vladimir Drozd, Evgen Gusola. These names will not tell you anything also because they're not translated. I mean, Ukraine is archipelago of unknown literature. It is true. But I will jump. I don't want to take 2 hours. Actually, when I was told that I have to talk 45 minutes, I thought it is too much. Now I think it is too little, but I know that everybody wants to have dinner at 8. In 91, actually, what also happened that we didn't have so much dissident literature. And the economical crisis of the collapse of the Soviet Union closed down almost all publishing houses. So we had life without books for several years. And those who wanted to read books, I mean, they were mostly buying Russian books brought to Ukraine, printed on very bad paper, and the genres which were not welcomed by the Communist Party: science fiction, crime stories, love stories, and erotic literature. Actually, Ukrainian post-Soviet literature was apolitical until 2004. Ukrainian writers were thinking that to write about politics or social issues, it's like to become again a new Soviet writer. And this is why actually in the first books, you will not find anything which will tell you about the state of the society in the most crucial crisis years of 1992, 93, 94. But from 97, we got a generation of about 20 young female writers and 1 male writer, Lyubko Dereš, who started writing books about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because this literature didn't exist in the Soviet time. And from this period until 2004, Ukrainian literature was decadent, postmodern, with a lot of humor, with not a lot of serious issues, but it had its following. And actually, I was present at one book launch, a conversation by Irena Karpa, at that time very famous young Ukrainian writer, who wrote also about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And there were 500 students in the audience in Dnipropetrovsk at that time, in mining academy. And they were excited. I mean, when you saw their eyes, of course, they were not buying the books. They were downloading pirates' copies, and this is another problem which didn't help Ukrainian literature to develop. But at least, actually, these writers became very famous immediately. And then 2004, we are jumping ahead to the Orange Revolution. The first time Ukrainian writers realized that actually there are political issues to be touched upon. And from this moment, actually, I think there was a big change. The authors, like crime author Andrej Kurkov, one of the most well-known crime authors in Ukraine, who was saying always that politics is rubbish, suddenly started actually writing not only about politics, but he started writing biographies of the politicians whom he liked. And one more thing, which I will probably repeat later, that he was writing, and many Ukrainian writers at that time, they were writing in Russian, although their mother tongue was Ukrainian, because the Russian language market was much bigger, and there was a hope that Russians will buy these books and sell also on Russian territory, which never happened, but for another reason. But suddenly, actually, Andrej Kurkov started writing in two languages, in Ukrainian and in Russian. And from 2007, 8, 9, he stopped writing in Russian altogether. He is ethnic Ukrainian from Nizhyn, from central east of Ukraine, from the motherland of Gogol. And actually, I mean, if I want just to stress again that Gogol is Ukrainian writer for me, not because he was born in Ukraine and he was writing about Ukraine, but because actually he infected Russian language with Ukrainian words. And if you read him in original, you will find out lots of new words which traveled then, thanks to him, from Ukrainian language into Russian. The other thing he did, he made Ukraine fashionable among St. Petersburg aristocracy. And suddenly Russian writers started writing about Ukrainian Cossacks and Ukrainian fairy tales, etc. I should sort of stop myself and channel my talk in a more direct way. But what I want to say that from 2007-8, Ukrainian young literature changed. And from 2013-14, from the Euromaidan time, from the moment of annexation of Crimea and beginning of the war in Donbass, Ukrainian literature became militant. But this was not actually the last change in Ukrainian literature, because now we have two militant Ukrainian literatures at the same time. Why? Because during the last 8 years, and the war began in 2014, about 400,000 motivated soldiers and volunteers went through the front lines of Donbass. And many of them started writing diaries, memoirs, short stories, novels about the war. And we got the whole wave of war veteran writers who set up their own publishing houses, who publish books only about the war. And when I was writing novel Grey Bees about Donbass, in 2017, there were already 200 books about the war in Donbass. So, I mean, now they coexist, and actually there's no competition. Actually, I know that veteran writers don't like traditional writers. There were some problems on Facebook, but most of Ukrainian intellectual problems taking place on Facebook. So I don't think we should take it very seriously. But anyway, the war changed, of course, not only the topic of writing of books. The war changed biographies and destinies of the writers, and I will mention a couple of writers just for you to understand that actually from 2014 we have a group of refugee writers inside Ukraine. And these were the writers of Lugansk region and Donetsk region, and several poets from Crimea who went to the continental Ukraine after annexation. At that time, the most famous in Donetsk living writer, Russian language writer, was Vladimir Rafeyenko, who before 2013, actually in 2011 and 12, was awarded in Moscow with the Russian Literature Prize, so-called Russiske Premia. He was published in Moscow. Nobody knew about him in Kyiv. This is also an issue because the Ukrainian literature never took the whole space of Ukraine. Ukrainian culture actually never covered geography of Ukraine, but this is will be mentioned later. But anyway, he had to flee with his wife. He left his library in Donetsk, his flat. He was given a house, a dacha, summer house, by Ukrainian writer Andrej Kurkov. And he moved, he started working as an editor. He started learning Ukrainian because he didn't speak very good Ukrainian. And as the result, actually, 3 years ago, he wrote his first novel in Ukrainian. And this novel was edited by this Andrej Kurkov, by his friend, very well-known translator and critic and writer. And it was published, and it was quite a symbolic event. So Vladimir Rafenko said in one interview that now he will write in Russian and in Ukrainian. During the events of the spring 2022, this year, he was under occupation in the house belonging to Ukrainian writer. He was trying to escape from there. It was almost impossible. People from Kyiv were trying to send some people with cars to take him away from occupation. And one driver got to this village next to Bucha, by the way, and got stuck in this house because there was shelling and because the Russian soldiers were controlling the streets. And sometimes they were shooting just at anybody or at any car. So in the end, actually, they managed to get out from this house to Kyiv. And later he went to Western Ukraine. And recently, well, 2 months ago, he gave an interview and he said that he will never write a word in Russian now in his life. Because, of course, he felt betrayed, not by the language, but by the fact, actually, that he himself was writing in Russian. And actually, he is ethnic Ukrainian, of course. He was addressing, I think, in his books also the audience probably of Russia, because, I mean, I never saw his books even in Russian in Kyiv bookshops. But he is not an only writer who was affected in such a way, because we have a writer from Lugansk, Alexei Chupa, who wrote always in Ukrainian and always about Lugansk life. And he was clever enough, he didn't stop in Kyiv. He went straight to Lviv for his sort of new abode, new house. The other writers and professors of Lugansk and Donetsk University, Olena Stashkina, and some others, I mean, they started writing in Ukrainian without public announcements. I mean, once they lost their home, they changed the language. It doesn't mean for me to change identity, because identity is more complicated than only sort of culture and language. But I suspect I wrote something about this. When I see that I didn't write, I will come back to this topic. But what I want to say that apart from literature becoming very militant, it changed languages. Ukrainian literature, actually, for me, is literature in many languages. The main language is Ukrainian, which is the only official state language, but of course there are many writers who still write in Russian, including me, although I wrote non-fiction book in Ukrainian. We have Hungarian language writers living in Western Ukraine, in Transcarpathia. We have one writer who writes in Gagauz language. This is the Turkic language, which is used in Bessarabia in Odessa region. And I suspect we have, of course, I should mention Crimean Tatars, who have dozens of writers who write in Crimean Tatar language, and about 15,000–20,000 of them left for continental Ukraine. The others remained in Crimea, but now they cannot travel to Ukraine, of course, because of the war. Perhaps in the context of writers whose lives have been shaken by Russian aggression, the most dire situation, actually, we can talk about today is that of the Crimean Tatars, for whom the war started not on February 24th of this year, but on February 2014, when the annexation started. And the Crimean Tatars, apart from being prolific poets, poetry is and was always more important for their culture than prose, they had very good journalists. And actually, after annexation, all journalists were arrested or detained or silenced. And then people, educated people who understood that they don't have honest journalists who report on their life, they started working as so-called civic journalists, volunteer journalists, creating websites and sharing the information for other Crimean Tatars. And of course, Russian secret services started immediately searching for them, finding them, imprisoning them on the charges either of drug use or terrorism. And then actually after one civic journalist was arrested, another person would become a civic journalist and would report also from searches and from the courtrooms. And now we have in Russian prisons more than 13 civic journalists, Crimean Tatars, but also journalists from Ukraine who lived in Crimea or who were visiting Crimea. And one of the last to be arrested is Vladislav Yosipenko. But yesterday there was a court announcement about Nariman Celal. And Nariman Celal is a professional journalist, a politician, one of political leaders of Crimean Tatars, and he was considered always too soft and too liberal. Well, he was arrested 1 year ago, and yesterday he was sentenced to 17 years in prison. He is already more than 1 year in prison, and there he started writing poetry and prose. What is interesting, actually, he writes prose in Crimean Tatar language and poetry in Crimean Tatar and in Russian language. And I am in touch with him all these months. You know that the only official language for Russian prisons is Russian language. You cannot write a letter in Buryat language, Chechen language, Ukrainian, whoever you are and whoever is imprisoned, even if he is Japanese, you can write to him only in Russian so that the authorities can read it, censor it, and pass it on. So I am keeping correspondence with Nariman Celal, but our letters are not checked by censorship because he writes me a letter and gives it to his attorney. Attorney gives to his wife Levisa. Levisa takes a photo and sends me by WhatsApp. And I write a letter, take a photo, send to her, and the same way back. And I asked actually Celal to write a letter about what he thinks about freedom of expression, especially for tonight. And I translated it and I will read it. It's a short letter, but I think it is very important to hear the voice of Nariman Celal. Together with him, actually, two of his friends, brothers Akhtem, of Aziz and Hassan, were imprisoned. And they were accused that they were trying, all three, to blow up a small gas pipe in the village in central Crimea. So you can imagine what kind of imagination the secret services of Russia have. I mean, in 1937, 36, I mean, the NKVD was much more inventive. I mean, the Russian writer Boris Pelnyak was executed because he was accused to be a Japanese spy living in Moscow. This is from Nariman Celal. I, as the vast majority of residents of the occupied territories, was able to feel the importance of freedom of speech for a full-fledged normal society. The right to express one's own opinion, primarily in public, without abusing this right, is one of the basic elements of democracy. Societies that restrict free speech, often with seemingly good intentions, are doomed to a distorted understanding of the reality that surrounds them. This distorted understanding changes the person himself or herself, their reflections and reactions to everything that happens around them. As a consequence, they are unable to respond to the challenges of the time and to those changes in life that lead to the destruction of their own society. This is what happened in Russia now. A society that allows the infringement of freedom of speech is unhealthy. In the beginning, an attack on freedom of speech may at first seem less obvious, less dangerous. But this is only a symptom, which, if left untreated, will develop into a serious illness. It is extremely important to ensure freedom of speech and find a balance between this right to freedom of speech and the protection of the public interest against the abuse of freedom of speech. In the occupied Crimea, freedom of speech is practically destroyed. Numerous restrictions on the right to express one's opinion have been introduced at the legislative level. Dozens of administrative cases under the article on the so-called discrediting the Russian army serve as evidence of this. That is, people are being punished for negative statements and opinions about Russian aggression against Ukraine. Today, people in Crimea are punished even for listening to Ukrainian songs, which, by the way, are not officially banned. Thus, a significant intimidated part of the Crimean society is forced to remain silent, which allows the authorities to lie about a certain unanimity of the Crimeans. Until 2014, before the annexation, the situation with freedom of speech was quite opposite. When the authorities tried to hide something, the independent journalistic community was always on guard, and people could express opposite opinions without fear of punishment. As a result, today people are being forced into the only correct opinion about both historical and contemporary events. I think this last statement is very important in the time when Russia is again rewriting Ukrainian history. And this will be taught in the schools. In the new history school books, there is not such a notion as Kyiv's Rus, Kievan Rus. So Kyiv doesn't play any role in ancient times. And there is no mention of Ukraine neither. And actually, if you notice, Putin doesn't mention the word Ukraine. For him, Ukraine is already erased from the map. For Ukraine, this is not the first war and not the first war with Russia. But for my generation and for younger generations, it is the first. The history of Russian-Ukrainian relations is a 400-year history of Russia's attempts to make Ukrainians Russians. It is the history of the struggle against the Ukrainian language and against Ukrainian identity. It is a story of punishment for Ukrainians who wanted to remain Ukrainians, and a story of privilege and success for Ukrainians who were ready to assimilate in Russia or later in the Soviet Union, who were ready to forget their identity and become a Soviet person in the USSR or a Russian in the Russian Empire. Lenin's dream of creating a new type of man, the Soviet man, was not a sign of madness or over-enthusiasm for biological science fiction. According to Lenin's plan, Soviet man should have no memory of his origins, his culture, or his native language. He had to forget all this and switch to Russian. When, under the agreement between Stalin and Hitler, better known as the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union annexed Western Ukraine and Bukovina, tens of thousands of Soviet functionaries, secret service officers, and organizers of Soviet life arrived there. When they heard someone using Ukrainian nearby, they would say, "Speak in a normal language." If a person did not know Russian, he was put out the door. This is how one of the last waves of Russification of Ukraine was carried out. In fact, actually, after 1921, when Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, there was a short period when Ukrainian literature and culture was given carte blanche. And at that time, of course, the Ukrainian intellectuals and writers and poets, they became very enthusiastic about revolution of 1917, about the Communist Party, about dreams of creating communist society. And actually, the communist system was trying to buy them, and they managed to do it. I mean, they made them privileged class. In Kharkiv, which became capital of Ukraine and remained capital of Ukraine until 1934, and at that time it was completely Ukrainian-speaking city. Today it is 1 million people speaking Russian. So the Communist Party built a whole complex, building complex, only for Ukrainian writers. This very famous building, which is called the Word, Slova. The story goes on more tragically because almost all inhabitants of this house were arrested in 1930s, sent to several concentration camps, gulag camps, mostly to Sandarmoch in the north, and executed. And it was the whole generation of young Ukrainian writers, poets, critics, translators, etc. Even now in the occupied territories, Russian officers and members of the Russian special services are constantly shouting at Ukrainian speakers with that familiar phrase, "Speak a normal language." Sometimes, surprisingly, these words are spoken not by ethnic Russians, but by Burats, Kalmyks, Chechens, and representatives of dozens of other ethnic groups of Russian Federation. Most often, these people know more about Russian culture than about their own. They respect and fear Moscow because they consider it is the capital of the world. In fact, Moscow was and remains the capital of fear. It takes away or tries to take away the identity of the peoples living on the territory of the Russian Federation, their language, their history. It is trying to remove the Tatar language from the educational process in Tatarstan, replacing it with Russian. In the same way, teaching in Ukrainian is now prohibited in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and school books are confiscated from school libraries, Ukrainian school books. At the beginning of the war, when Russian troops bombed the museum of the well-known Ukrainian primitivist artist Maria Primachenko, I doubted that the museum had been destroyed on purpose by deliberately aimed fire. After the destruction of the museum of the Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda near Kharkiv, after the murder of the Ukrainian translator from ancient Greek Alexander Kisluk on the threshold of his own house, after the shelling of universities, schools, churches, and libraries, I no longer had any doubt about the fact that this war was not just for territories. The purpose of Putin's war is the destruction of Ukraine itself, of Ukrainians, and the very concept of Ukrainianis. Actually, Putin has never tried to hide his ambition. I will not quote all the ways that he has said that Ukraine should not exist. Doctors do not quote the words of the mentally ill, do they? It is unethical. But the general point of these words suggests the importance of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian history. Their significance is so great that it has made Ukrainian culture the target of the most expensive ballistic missiles Russia has at its disposal. And why is this? How is it that a culture can be seen as such a tremendous threat that it must be destroyed? As I see it, it is because culture legitimizes the people living on their land. Culture is proof of the inseparable connection between a people and its territory of residence, its country. Culture records and retells the history of a people and their country. If you destroy culture, the people left without it will not be able to prove anything, even in an international court. Of course, there is also world culture, which is like a backup archive. It can share information about peoples and their stories, but world culture does not have an army. World culture, like the United Nations, has not yet taken a single step to protect the Crimean Tatar people from new deportations, from vicious repressions against the most active section of Crimean Tatar society. Of course, we must acknowledge that more could have been done inside Ukraine over the 30 years of its independence to shore up the cultures of all the country's ethnic minorities. Ukraine did not pay attention to the culture of the Crimean Tatars, the Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia, the culture of the Bulgarians in Bessarabia, or the Gagauz in the Odessa region. Truth to tell, Ukraine did not even pay attention to its own culture, because politicians did not understand the connection between identity and culture, identity and language. We have not properly understood the importance of identity itself. Ukrainian culture has always been an island, at times a surprisingly small island, so small that it was in danger of disappearing. For centuries, attempts have been made to force Ukrainians to forget their native language, to stop singing Ukrainian songs, and to abandon their history. Over the past 400 years, Russia has been undermining the Ukrainian language and culture. In the 17th century, Ukrainian church books were banned and destroyed. In 1720, Peter the Great signed a decree banning the publication of any book in the Ukrainian language. In 1763, Catherine II forbade the use of Ukrainian as language of tuition at the oldest Ukrainian university, the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. In 1804, teaching in Ukrainian was forbidden in schools. In 1884, Tsar Alexander III banned theatrical performances in Ukrainian. 4 years later, in 1888, he also banned the use of the Ukrainian language in official institutions and made it unlawful to give a Ukrainian name to a child at baptism. In 1892, a decree was signed banning the translation of books from Russian into Ukrainian. I am very happy my books are translated into Ukrainian, which means that this decree doesn't work anymore. But it's not only my books, actually. Ukrainians translated a lot of classical Russian literature, including Chekhov and Dostoevsky and Bulgakov and any others, because Ukrainians are also curious and they want to live in an open world. The Russian Revolution, during Ukraine's 300-year term as part of the Russian Empire, various tsars signed more than 40 decrees prohibiting or restricting the use of the Ukrainian language in Ukraine. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought Ukraine only a short period of independence. By 1921, the country was once more part of the new Russian Empire, Soviet one, in which Russification of all vassals states was key priority. In the 1970s and 1980s, I remember anyone who spoke Ukrainian was assumed to be either an ardent nationalist or an uneducated peasant. Thankfully, things are different now. The Ukrainian language has begun to return to the territories from which it was expelled as a result of the Russification policy. However, the threat to Ukraine and to Ukrainian culture remains, and because of Russian aggression, the threat is very great. President Vladimir Putin is treading in the footsteps of the Russian Tsars. In the occupied areas of Ukraine, teaching must take place in Russian only, as I said. Ukrainian school books are being withdrawn. Assimilation camps have been prepared in Russia to which Ukrainians will be taken to be forcibly taught Russian traditions and customs and turned into Russian people. When we talk about the tragedy of war, we cover the topic with a heavy blanket, each of us imagining the details of that tragedy in our own way. Even inside Ukraine, few people have a clear understanding of the immediate, let alone long-term consequences of Russia's aggression on everyday life, on culture, on literature, or on attitudes. Perhaps, indeed, the victims of any aggression are the last people to fully appreciate how the mistreatment they have experienced has affected them. We will need therapy, but even imagining a time when we will be able to examine our wartime attitudes squarely and calmly is like a breath of fresh air, the promise of a new beginning, the chance to rebuild our homes. I think writers will also need therapy. In fact, actually, in today's Ukrainian literature, we have much more books about war than love stories. I mean, love stories are gone from the Ukrainian literature today. And actually, if the war takes the major part of the novels in the country, it means that the war will continue even if the fighting stops. Today, the entire democratic world is helping Ukraine in this war, helping with weapons and humanitarian aid. But there is another way to help that does not require funding. It does require a little personal time from everyone who wants to help. Ukrainian history and culture are still little known in Europe and in the world. So I ask you to find and read non-fiction books about the history of Ukraine, such as Anne Applebaum's Red Hunger, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, or Sergei Plokhy's Gate of Europe. Also, you can read, and I love these books, Philip Sand's East-West Street, and books by Martin Pollock is Austrian historian and writer who writes about Western Ukraine. Find books also by Ukrainian writers. Take the time to learn a little more about Ukraine than you know now. Also, I think actually that most of the books about the war from Ukraine will not be translated into Norwegian, and maybe it is good. Because, I mean, Ukrainians don't want to be associated with the war. I mean, nobody who is victim doesn't want to be associated with the crime when he became or she became victim. So maybe my last wish would be to, well, I mean, to follow not only the news on Ukraine, but to follow cultural life in Ukraine. And if there is a chance, if you see a poster with Ukrainian musicians playing in Norway, maybe they will be fundraising for Ukraine, please join them, as well as if there is any art exhibition from Ukraine. I want you to know Ukraine better, and I know that the world is open to Ukraine. Ukraine has a niche so that Ukrainian culture would be properly part of international culture, of world culture. Thank you very much.